Hi, I'm Vicki Dunn, one of the organizers for tonight's program. The organizers would like to say thank you to our sponsors, Fired Up Pinellas, Indivisible Florida 13, the League of Women Voters of the St. Pete area, and Women Talk Black. Welcome to a community conversation about the freedom to vote, voter rights, choices, and access. Tonight's event will be recorded and will be available on the Indivisible Florida 13 website and the Fired Up Pinellas website. This is the third in a series of community conversations. In January, we looked at COVID and vaccines. Our February topic was food insecurity here in Pinellas. And in May, our program will focus on mental health in Pinellas. These community conversations are an effort to build a stronger community by educating one another about the issues that we face here in Pinellas, exploring possible ways to bring about improvement, and taking action together towards a better life for all of us. Now, I am especially honored to introduce you to our moderator, Stephanie Owens. Stephanie is the principal of Dolphin Strategies in St. Petersburg, which creates public education and participation strategies to deliver impactful citizen engagement. Clients have been the American Cancer Society and the National Football League. Stephanie is also a veteran voting rights advocate, working to increase voter access and modernize election administration and policy, and all from the voters, the citizens' perspective. She was part of the 2000 Florida Bush v. Gore recount, which we all remember. She served as a Florida lobbyist for the League of Women Voters and for Common Cause. In 2020, she developed the NAACP National Grassroots Voter Protection Program and created a statewide election protection framework. Stephanie is also the founder of Women Talk Black, designed to elevate the views and voices of Black women in civic engagement. So, Stephanie, I turn the program over to your hands.
Thank you, Vicki, and thanks to all of tonight's sponsors. Welcome everyone to this very timely and important discussion on the freedom to vote. Despite the pandemic, 77% of eligible Florida voters cast ballots statewide in 2020. It's the highest turnout in 65 years. State officials and courts across Florida and the country confirmed that the 2020 election was secure. Florida's governor said we had the most transparent and efficient election anywhere in the country. Florida's success is deeply rooted in dedicated supervisors of elections like the one that we have here in Pinellas County, and through the work of the tireless voter advocates that we have on the phone. However, today there are over 361 bills across 47 different states with restrictive voting provisions. And tomorrow, Florida may very well join Georgia and other states in passing legislation that reduces voter access. We have two amazing panelists this evening that will discuss this issue with us. First, meet Patti Brigham. Patti is the president of the Florida League of Women Voters. Patti is a proven national and Florida grassroots leader and coalition builder. Patti joined the League of Women Voters Florida's state board in 2015 and became president of the organization in 2018. Our other panelist is the Deputy Supervisor of Elections for Pinellas County, Dustin Chase. Before we hear from our panelists, I'd like to see what we think we already know about voting in Pinellas. So let's do a quick poll. If we could, let's put the poll on the screen, and I'd love for everyone to answer these 3 questions. If you don't see the 3rd question, just scroll on your screen and you'll see that 3rd question. So go right to your screen and click the answer that you believe is correct. First question, what percentage of people voted by mail in Pinellas County in 2020 and the general election? The second question is, under law, how often do you have to sign up to vote by mail? And I am going to scroll. Third question, how many drop boxes were used in Pinellas County in the 2020 general election? And we'll give everyone a few minutes. Do we have any fancy prizes that we can give away? I know there's a League of Women Voters t-shirt around here somewhere. Oh, I have something that's so cool. I'm going to do a show and tell while we're waiting. This is from our Supervisor of Elections office.
Yep.
But I'm not giving it away.
Well, you know, I can give them away. So if you want to give a few of those away, let us know the information of the individual who comes closest to winning, and we're happy to send them some coasters.
We'll do it. So, question number 1, what percentage of people voted by mail in Pinellas County? And everyone knows the correct answer. The correct answer is 61% of voters in Pinellas voted by mail. Question number 2, under current law, how often do you have to sign up to vote by mail? Everyone knows that answer correctly. It is currently every 2 years. And the third question, how many drop boxes were used in Pinellas County during the general election? Oh, wow. Pinellas, you guys, we're off the chain. That is also the correct answer. There were 35 of the drop boxes in Pinellas County. So thank you, everyone.
No, there were not 35.
I said 25? 25.
It was close to 25, and it was 25 for a while, but we added one at the last minute. So it's 26.
Oh, so it was kind of a trick question.
It wasn't. I thought you did that on purpose. It was
No, I did not. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Dustin.
Yeah.
So why don't we go ahead and let's get started. And Dustin, why don't I start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about Pinellas's free and fair election that we just held?
Sure. Well, I thank you first for being here on behalf of Supervisor Marcus, who got her COVID vaccine. And like many of the people who get their COVID vaccine, she's experiencing really terrible symptoms. So that's why I'm here in her place today. She and across the board, people in Pinellas County, I think, have attributed successful Pinellas County elections to a few different constituents. Number one is, of course, the voters. Our electorate came to the polls this year being more engaged and more educated than they ever have before. And they really took advantage of their options. They understood that voting by mail was an option. They understood early voting was an option, and they ultimately understood that election day was an option. By and large, people took advantage of the mail ballot option and early voting. So by 7:00 p.m. on 7:05 p.m. on election night, we had more than 82% of all results reported. on votepinellas.com. That's a real success. And the reason is because we were able to tabulate such a large portion of the election prior to election day. So when we got to election night, we were able to report 100% precincts reporting by 8:17 p.m. We consider that a massive, unbelievable success. And it all is attributable to the voters for being educated and engaged. And then we also have to thank our partners in the community for making it a success. We have people like the League of Women Voters, both the Democrat and the Republican parties helped us to get out the vote, helped us to educate people on their voting options and what they needed to know to vote in a very difficult, challenging time in the middle of a global pandemic. And then we have to thank the legislature. They, unlike some other state legislatures across the country, did not take the opportunity during the pandemic to drastically change election laws. And that helped provide with election administrators with a line of stability who ultimately helped us to make the election a success. And then finally, Governor DeSantis with his executive order essentially allowed us to begin tabulating ballots as soon as the pre-election logic and accuracy test had been completed. So those are really the five main takeaways, the constituents we feel had the greatest impact on ensuring successful elections. And we are very, as we look into 22, hopeful that some of the education and engagement that we saw in 2020 will continue to help us secure great elections.
That's great, Dustin. Thank you. So Patti, it sounds like we had an amazing election here in Pinellas. We had an amazing election across the state, but there's a new bill in the legislature. Can you talk to us a little bit about that bill and the impact it will have on voter access?
Of course, and thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to the sponsors for inviting me to be here tonight. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and especially the League of St. Pete, and see you, Stephanie, again. Well, there's actually a multi-pronged attack on our voting rights here in Florida. We've seen the emergence of two bills, Senate Bill 90, which would have, in its original form, we have seen an amendment filed today by its sponsor, Dennis Baxley, that would significantly change the bill, but in its original form, Senate Bill 90 would require voters to re-up their vote by mail status every single year. And it would eliminate all of the ballot drop boxes that are so convenient to voters. And 1.5 million Florida voters used those ballot drop boxes last year. So they're critical, especially in, Florida's a tourism state, not just Central Florida with Disney and the theme parks, but many other parts of Florida. Tourists travel to the coastal communities. So service workers work all sorts of odd hours, right? And they don't necessarily have time to go to the early vote sites or the polling places during the kind of hours that they're open. So those drop boxes are especially critical to our service workers. So getting rid of those would be a huge mistake because it would lessen the number of people voting. Then we see a bill in the House Bill 7041, which was just heard last Thursday, which is quite sweeping. Now that one would not eliminate all of the ballot drop boxes. However, it would require them to be manned whenever they're open. And what's so absurd about the next part of this drop box provision is that when a voter goes to drop his or her ballot, which is in the signed and sealed envelope, that voter would have to show identification to the SOE's employee or volunteer manning that drop box. Now, let me ask you a question. Say there's a post box or a mailbox right across the street from that ballot drop box. If you walk across the street to the mailbox, put a stamp on that ballot, nobody's standing there asking for your voter identification, your driver's license or your ID. So to ask for it for the ballot drop boxes does not make any sense whatsoever. And it would also create long lines. You don't want to have long lines at the drop boxes. That's one of the reasons that we love them so much, is that they prevent long lines. So while it wouldn't do away with the drop boxes altogether, it would add those stipulations that this revision of the House bill would also subject our supervisors of elections to a $25,000 civil penalty if drop boxes are available when early voting is not underway. So there are a number of penalties that we're very concerned about regarding these new bills. And the question is that why are we trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist? We had 77% turnout last year. That was the highest since 1992. Why are we trying to look for a problem when there is none? The governor came out and said, as Stephanie mentioned at the outset of this presentation, that we had a great election in 2020, yet in the same breath turns around and says, yet we need major election reform. That makes no sense whatsoever. And Stephanie, if I could later on, perhaps there are two other bills that would that are aiming to silence the voice of the voters through direct democracy that we believe are just as important as these attack on our voting rights.
Thank you for that, Patty. And absolutely, as we go further, if you want to comment on those, that's no problem. So I want to thank those of you who sent questions in advance. Those are the questions that I'm going to go through this evening. But if there's something else that comes to you and you want to have that answered, if you'll put that in the Q&A, if we have time, we will get to it. And if we don't have time, we'll get an answer. And if you include your email address, we'll send that information back to you. So Dustin, my first question is going to be for you. Patty talked specifically about some of the elements of the legislation that would be harmful to voters. There was at some point some indication that if the bill was to pass and it would stop or it would require voters to have to re-request their vote by mail, that might go into effect immediately.
Right.
And I'm wondering, does immediately mean in July? And for us here in Pinellas, especially in St. Pete, we have elections this year. How will this impact us? How will you notify citizens? Tell us a little bit about how we're going to be impacted if this goes into effect immediately.
Well, let's all hope that this doesn't go into effect, right? And the particular provision of the bill that you're talking about was a few versions ago. So the effective date on that would have been July 1st. And that would have adversely impacted the elections for the August primary in St. Pete and the St. Pete Beach referendum election. But I would like to point out, though, the timelines might have made it such that we would have sent out the ballots regardless of what the legislation would have meant for the August primary. Uncertain, certainly, because of the legislation, it never made it to that point. But we would have certainly have had to notify all of the voters of this potential law, and that would have cost, we ran the numbers on this, and to notify every active registered voter in Pinellas County of a mail ballot request being essentially wiped off the book would have cost us about $535,000. Because you have to keep in mind that includes the postcard, that includes the outbound postage, that includes the inbound postage, and that's not including the staff time to process all of those. So with regard to the effective date, it doesn't appear that that's in the latest version, either 7041 or Senate Bill 90. It could always come back up again. That was originally in Senate Bill 90. The most recent version of Senate Bill 90 does not have that language at all. And we've actively lobbied the legislature to remove all of that language. I do believe that the newest proposed language that's in there would require that you place a request for a mail ballot every general election cycle. So that would mean that if you request one now, it would be good through November of 2022. And then if you placed one because the language is in the next ensuing general election. And our attorneys, who are fantastic, could try to figure out what exactly the definition of the word next is. Is it this general election that was coming up, or is it the next general election? So there's plenty of room for interpretation on all of that.
Dustin, I want to stick with you for a minute. What other areas of this legislation is problematic for supervisors of elections?
As Patti was mentioning earlier, the legislation that discusses potentially requiring identification at the polls is one issue, and it creates multiple complications that people might not even think about. You know, for one, if I tell you you're going to have to bring a ballot, an ID with your ballot to a drop box, that doesn't seem like a big deal because we often have to show our IDs for everything. But if I tell you you have to bring the ID with you and an attestation for someone you're bringing the ballot back, the first question is, what is an attestation? I mean, I had to Google what the word attestation meant because it is so unfamiliar to people. And especially in Pinellas County, when you have voters who have been using this methodology now for 12 years, almost 13 years, they're going to need to be re-educated on the process that you can't bring your friend's ballot back with you. So that creates problems. As Patti was saying, that also will create lines, potentially at drop box locations. But another kind of just weird one is the law requires you to have a wet signature on file with us in order for you to vote by mail. So you could place a request for a vote by mail ballot. We would send you the vote by mail, you fill it out and everything. And when you send it back to us, we would only be able to look at a signature on in the voter registration database of a wet signature. And just think about this. You know, as I told you earlier, I registered to vote in 2008. I registered at the Department of Motor Vehicles. I signed on an electronic pad. So even myself as a deputy supervisor of elections, I don't have a wet signature on file. And it's not tens of thousands of people in Pinellas County who don't have wet signatures on file. It is hundreds of thousands of people in Pinellas County that don't have wet signatures on file. And it is millions of people across Florida who don't. So this complication will certainly create problems for the voter, but it will also create backlogs for canvassing boards who will then have to reach out to those voters to try to cure that the mail ballot through the mail ballot cure process, and essentially create a situation where we might not be able to certify elections under mandated legal deadlines because the process will just become so clogged.
Thank you for sharing that. So Patti, there are lots of very interesting things in this legislation. There's something in the legislation about water and snacks.
That's
What's
right.
up with water and snacks?
That's created quite a stir. In the original 7041, and it's been taken out of Senate Bill 90, you could not pass out water or snacks to anyone waiting in line at the polls. And everyone who has lived in Florida for even a few months knows that Florida, even in November, say we're talking about the general election in November, can be very hot. So if you have eliminated or restricted ballot boxes, then you're going to have longer lines. And many groups pass out water and snacks. The league a few years ago in the 2018 election did party at the polls. We had pizza and all sorts of things to make voting fun and celebratory. So that would eliminate that. Now, this new version of Senate Bill 90, which we expect to be heard tomorrow and likely to pass, would allow only the supervisors and their employees to pass out water. So other groups still would not be able to pass out water.
So Dustin, that's out of your budget then, correct?
Well, I would say that the first problem is that anyone is standing in line long enough to need water or food. And we do our absolute best to make sure that nobody in Pinellas County is standing in line longer than 30 minutes at election day polling place and longer than an hour at an early voting place. So if you get hungry within that hour time frame at an early voting location, really sorry about that. So I don't know that this is a big issue across Pinellas County, but there is certainly a faction of people who contact us who don't want to be harassed, for lack of better words, when they're at a polling place. So even if you are like a very unassuming person who would not be ever trying to sway a person to vote one way or another, it can be perceived as intimidation. And I would like to apologize for my dogs. Hey, shh, Baxter, come here.
It sounds like they don't agree that water is intimidating.
They typically don't agree with anything I say, to be completely honest. And they're expecting their father to be home soon. So, and I would like to clean up one thing I said about the wet signature, because I've noticed that we got a few questions in the chat with regard to that. A wet signature would be a signature that you have signed on a voter registration application or a cure affidavit. And there is a question about whether or not that would be in conflict with the motor voter law. And in our correspondence with the legislature, we have pointed out the fact that the motor voter law does allow you to register at a Department of Motor Vehicles. So there is some question about whether that would be in conflict with existing law. And we just hope that that is stricken or amended in some way.
Okay. Thank you. Patty, is there any information on whether organizations, certified third-party voter registration organizations like the League, is there any information as to whether or not we will still be allowed to deliver vote by mail request forms?
We're still trying. Go ahead.
No.
We are still trying to unpack the third-party voter registration language in this new delete all from Senate Bill 90. I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but we're still unpacking that language.
Okay.
And Dustin may be able to answer that, since I know that the supervisors have been working with the legislators to make these changes.
I don't see that there would be anything that would prevent that. The new mail ballot language in the bill does create more requirements or requests for information, and some of that information is exempt from public disclosure. So I would say that might be an area of the complication, like a social security number, driver's license is exempt from protected information. So I mean, I don't see it being a problem. No.
Okay. All right. Dustin, the law would require 150-foot no solicitation around a drop box.
I think they're just doing this to make it congruent with what is at early voting sites. In Pinellas County, we had 26 early mail ballot drop-off locations, and we didn't see any issues. And it's not like people are going to mail ballots drop-off sites to like fill out a ballot. They're literally going there to deposit their ballot in one of our big black mail ballot drop-off locations and leave. It's a very quick transaction. So your guess as to why they're putting this in the law is as good as mine, but we don't see it being an issue for Pinellas voters.
Is it going to be something that is easily implementable? And I asked that question in the context of so many volunteers who help at the polls. How are you going to do that with a drop box?
Well, we have a training process for all of the election workers who help us. Okay. And it would be as easy as simply handing them the schematics of the drop-off location, showing them where to put the cones. Basically, it would be the same as a polling place. So I don't view it as a cost issue. I view it as more of a common sense issue as to why it would even be necessary.
Okay, thank you. Patty, this legislation, does it have any particular impact on any community in general? Does it limit voting access for minority communities or underserved communities, or does it disenfranchise equally across the board?
Well, in many ways, it disenfranchises equally across the board. And what we've been telling Floridians, because we believe that the will of the legislature is going to be very hard to change this year, to be quite frank, we are telling in our public education programs, all of your voting rights are under attack. But yes, if you limit, as one of these bills, the language is changed to do, if you limit these ballot drop boxes to being just in areas of early vote centers or at supervisors of elections offices and not in other parts of the community, you're going to see some underserved communities being ignored. That is our fear. We already know that underserved communities of color are being ignored as it is. So if we're concerned about another excuse to make it harder for those communities to easily vote.
And I want to stay with you in this space for a little bit, Patti. Other states are going through something similar, and many of the advocates there have been working with corporations to join in their support of increasing voter access, not decreasing it. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening here in Florida and whether it's effective?
Right, and we know that other states are getting involved with asking corporations to, come out against these voting attacks. AARP in Florida came out today and was very critical of these bills. But as far as corporations, we haven't heard of any of the biggies, like, for example, Disney World. It would be great if the gigantic corporations like Disney would come out, because Disney employs how many thousands of Floridians, and of course the hotel industry. It would make an incredible statement if they would come out as well, like we've seen other corporations in other states do, like Delta was one of them, for example. What a powerful message that would send our state legislature. And we are hopeful that some corporations in Florida would come out.
I'm going to ask this question of both of you, and Dustin, I'll start with you. Are there elements of the legislation that are particularly damaging to the disabled community?
Well, there is a provision in 7041, I believe, that limits who would be able to take your mail ballot from you to deliver it to a mail ballot drop-off location. And it limits it to a family member or a roommate. Well, some people in disabled communities don't have either one of those things. They're relying on their friend down the road or down the hall from them to take that ballot, and they trust that person. So that is particularly difficult for them to get their ballot back. And there is no provision in Florida law which would allow any sort of an electronic voting. You can't email your ballot back to us unless you're overseas and fit certain parameters. So the answer, is that's very disconcerting. Luckily, Supervisor Marcus has made the decision to pay for postage, return postage on mail ballots moving forward. That has increased our budget by approximately $350,000, but that provides access. And I think that one piece of education that as we move forward into 2022 and certainly into 2024, that we need to work on as the Supervisor of Elections Office is telling people how to use their mailbox. I have a mailbox in front of my own front yard. And for me to mail my ballot back, I live in Hillsborough County, I would have to walk out to the mailbox, put it in my mailbox, and flip up the little flag thing. I think that there is a number of people who don't realize that, especially as it relates to, the top of the millennial generation, like 41-ish down through some of the zennials. And that's a big block of voters, who need to be educated on how to use the United States Postal Service. So I know that that's a very long-winded answer about, who would be disenfranchised. But at the end of the day, if people can't get their ballots back to us or can't get to an early voting site, that causes some complications for them. And, if I might just add one thing to what Patti was saying with regard to challenges with, I totally lost it. It was an important point about what you were saying. I know it was.
It'll come back to you.
Oh.
Patti, do you want to add on disability access?
I would, and I'd particularly like to focus on seniors who are disabled and, for example, live in nursing homes or retirement communities and rely on the staff there. And in the past, there's been arrangements made that they could designate someone at those facilities, especially if the person in the senior center, the nursing home was disabled, and many are. And there would be arrangements made between the supervisor of elections in that particular county and that facility to have an exchange of ballots. Under this original version of Senate Bill 90, and I'm saying the original version because we still don't know if the amendment's going to pass tomorrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a requirement that would allow only an immediate family member to drop off that other family member's ballot. So say, for example, your mother lives in Pensacola and she is disabled and lives alone, and there's no immediate family member in her area, and you're the daughter and you live in Miami. What are you going to go up to Pensacola so you can get your mom's ballot and deliver it? I mean, that's not realistic in all cases. It's not fair to that disabled voter who lives by herself and is elderly, because that means that she, under Senate Bill 90, is not going to have an immediate family member or someone necessarily living in that residence to make sure that her vote will count. Her vote will not count.
Dustin, any comment there?
She's right. It's hard to talk about something in such a hypothetical way as legislation. Sure. But at the end of the day, ultimately, we want people to get ballots back to us. And there are many processes in place to make sure that that whole system is secure. So in Florida, you have to request a mail ballot in order to receive one. There's not a law that allows us to just send out mail ballots to anyone. But the good part about that is that we know who we're getting mail ballots back from. Therefore, when we get a mail ballot back, we know we can compare the signature on this certificate envelope to ensure that it matches the signature of the person who requested it. And that is a really fundamental issue in ensuring the integrity of the mail ballot process. So any parameters or guardrails that one might be putting on mail ballots is more about perception than it is about reality. And one thing we like to point out is that there's no fraud in the last election. We didn't see people out harvesting ballots. And for the sake of this discussion, harvesting ballot is defined in Florida Statute 104 about someone who is possessing more than 2 ballots, at any one time. So it's just a battle for us at the moment, and we're trying to make sure that we win mail ballots because we believe it's a way to provide access to everyone across the board, and it's safe and secure, and Floridians are very comfortable with the process.
Thank you. We're going to have a lot of education to do in June and July and August and moving forward. Another vote by mail question. You can now you can indicate on your envelope that you want to continue vote by mail. Do we know if that's changing at all, that particular way of indicating?
So I know what you're talking about. And I simply don't know. We will have to have our attorneys take a really good, long, hard look at that. because it's going to be requesting information, one, that some people are not required to have under the law. You know, not everyone has to have a driver's license, a social security number, or a Florida ID number. So then what about for those people? And by the way, there are 28,000 people in Pinellas County who don't have one of those. And the law does not provide an exemption for those people. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done with regard to that whole section.
Thank you. So I think we all seem to agree that the bill has a lot of disadvantages, and we know that it's up for hearing tomorrow. What can those participating today do to push back on these legislative changes that don't seem to be improving our system, and in fact will hurt many Floridians across the state? And Patti, I'll go to you first.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, the League of Women Voters of Florida has put out an action alert on this bill that will be heard tomorrow. We put out multiple action alerts. I think, you know, Stephanie, I think we put out more action alerts this legislative session than I can remember, because there are so many concerning bills moving. So what we're asking everyone to do, we provide the names of everyone on the committee, their email addresses, their phone numbers, and we're asking the public and all league members, and pass it on to all of your friends and family and neighbors, whoever you want to pass these on to, this action alert, to call or email these legislators, these senators, and tell them to vote down on Senate Bill 90. So that is a very powerful and effective tool. We know that public pressure works. It doesn't always work, but we know it can work because it's worked in the past. We need to continue to educate the public about these bills. You know, everyone here on this webinar and in these organizations, we're all super news readers, but a lot of the public is not necessarily, picking up the newspaper every day or watching the news. So we need to educate. And as you pointed out earlier, Stephanie, we're going to have a lot of education to do if these bills pass, and they're likely going to pass. So that's probably one of the strongest things we can do to fight other bills that may be coming down the pike next year that are even worse, is educate. And then, of course, once again, the bill will be heard tomorrow on the Senate Rules Committee. Write to your newspapers, write letters to the editor, write op-eds, but pass the word that these bills are out there and they're going to change the way you can vote. They're going to restrict your voting rights, and that it's absolutely needless and unnecessary and absolutely undemocratic.
Thank you for that. Dustin, you've mentioned a couple of numbers. I think you mentioned $535,000 to send this mailing back and forth. If drop boxes have to be staffed or womaned, if you will, then that means you're going to need staffing at a variety of drop boxes. I imagine that there are many other costs that will be associated with the parameters of this bill. Where is that money going to come from if it's not in your budget?
So Pinellas County has had ballot drop-off boxes since 2010, and baked into our budget is a deputized pair of election workers at every single mail ballot drop-off location. So if you come to one of our mail ballot drop-off locations, we are the model for what has become the law. And Supervisor Clark and Supervisor Marcus working together put together these set of parameters that we currently use. So a budgetary issue isn't an issue at this point because we have that in our budget already for 2 deputized election workers and all of the chain of custody and auditing procedures associated with mail ballot drop-off locations. So that's not going to be an issue for us.
And that's great for us in Pinellas. And I imagine that other 66 counties that may not have robust budgets,
Right.
may not have the opportunity to implement these laws the way that they're being written. And so voters will be perhaps disenfranchised for other reasons.
You're right, Stephanie. It's an unfunded mandate.
Mhm.
County commissions fund supervisors of elections. And to answer your question, for the other 66 counties, they're going to have to either close their mail ballot drop-off locations and pay for return postage, or they're going to have to ask their county commission for money to support mail ballot drop-off locations.
Okay. So let me just recap. I want to make sure I understand this. We had a great election without many challenges or fraudulent activity. We had more people voting than they have in 65 years. We have more people using the vote by mail system, and it worked well. And yet we have massive legislation to make changes that present an unfunded mandate, is going to disproportionately impact certain communities, seniors, disabled, minority communities. Everyone may not be able to afford, all the counties rather, may not be able to afford to implement this. There's a massive amount of education to make sure that people understand all of these changes. And part of what we can do is write the people that we elected and tell them this isn't what we ask you to do. So Patti, I'll ask you this question. There's also another remedy, right? You could sue.
Well, there is always that remedy, yes. And Stephanie, I like to say that, in the League of Women Voters, and we always say this, we educate and we advocate because we're a C3 and a C4, but we also litigate. We litigated after former Secretary of State Ken Dinser prohibited early voting sites on college and university campuses. We litigated that twice and we won. So as a result, 65,000 young people on college and university campuses voted at those sites in 2018. We litigated on Amendment 4, which went all the way up to the 11th Circuit. And unfortunately, we got some wins along the way, but we did not win that overall case. Fines and fees are still attached to voting for ex-felons. But the league has litigated in the past very successfully on fair districts and other voting rights issues. So you can bet that it's not just the league, but other organizations who are ready to go with lawsuits on this really un-American attack on our voting rights.
Thank you. Dustin, you are not given the opportunity to comment on that question at all. I'm going to skip right past you.
Thank you.
There is also federal legislation that is up for consideration that would address some of the things that we're talking about. Would either of you like to comment on that legislation and how it might impact what we're seeing happen, not just here in Florida, but across the nation? And I'll ask if you want to comment on that, Dustin, and if not, I'll go right to Patti.
So we're laser focused on legislative issues in Florida right now. And when the time becomes appropriate for us to shift our focus to pressing issues at the federal level, I'm sure Supervisor Marcus will take the opportunity then.
Okay, thank you. Patti.
Well, I'm glad you asked this question, Stephanie, because the League of US and the League of Florida is very much behind the For the People Act, known as HR 1 and Senate Bill 1. And it is the most expansive reform of voting rights we have seen since the Voting Rights Act. What it would do, it would protect voting rights. It would eliminate dark money from elections. It would restore transparency and accountability in our government. It would curb partisan and racial gerrymandering. And of course, that's very important because we have redistricting coming up next year. Hopefully it would reduce that or prohibit it once and for all. More voters than ever participated. We talked about it tonight in the 2020 election. So in many ways, this legislation, if passed, would address making vote by mail accessible, which we've discussed at length tonight. And the league at all levels wants to see these kinds of permanent fixes, automatic voter registration, for example, same-day voter registration, and the elimination of any barriers to voting. And so we are very hopeful that the Voting Rights Act, or excuse me, not the For the People's Act, HR 1, will get a fair hearing and pass. And it would also have a major and dramatic impact on these bills should they pass in Florida, because federal law supersedes state law.
Thank you for that, Patty, which brings me to a question, Justin, that I hope that you can reflect on. So one of the things that happened recently, I believe it was last week, Atlanta's mayor issued an executive order, if you will, to assist and mitigate some of the cause of the election laws that passed in Georgia. Georgia has far more counties than we do, but here in Pinellas County, if each municipality was going to try and create legislation or policy to help, how would that impact the Supervisor of Elections office to have different municipalities trying to create policy to mitigate the state law?
So we are essentially, we provide contract services to each municipality, and therefore each municipality has a supervisor of elections, and that is the city clerk of each municipality. So at a municipal level, we already basically work with each individual supervisor of elections to conduct the elections the way in which they would like them to be conducted, with some latitude given to us for things like mail ballots, so we can have consistency across the board for all of our voters. But in cases of a contest, in cases of an election where the people on the ballot, the candidates on the ballot are state candidates, they would obviously have to defer to state legislation, and we would not be able to at all listen to the jurisdiction like St. Pete. We would be forced into following state law.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that answer. So we're due to close at 7:30, and I want to give Patty the opportunity to talk about a couple of other issues that are facing us. But before I do that, it would be great to get some closing comments on not just what's happening in the legislature, but from both of your perspectives, what should be happening? Short-term and long-term, what are some of the real challenges or opportunities in our election administration process, in the voting system, that we should be thinking about trying to advance and improve the access to voting? And Dustin, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you to the sponsors for hosting this. You know, we are very focused on making sure that many of the proposed laws don't eventually become law in the state of Florida. The Florida Supervisors of Elections are actively working with legislators to bring forth some of our own priorities. And one of the greatest concerns that voters constantly express to us is that their private information becomes public, because in the state of Florida, the voter registration database is public record. So one of our legislative priorities is to try and protect the voter registration database, which will cut down on the number of harassing phone calls that they receive from candidates, political parties. That's one hope that we have. We're also hoping that the critical infrastructure part of election administration, meaning security around the tabulation system, cybersecurity, is protected and exempt from public disclosure pursuant to Florida statute. And then finally, we're hoping that we will have more days to tabulate ballots once the logic and accuracy test is completed. And ultimately, what we're most hopeful for is consistency, because as election administrators, we believe that incremental changes are best for the entire process. Because when you have large scale changes, it doesn't just create administration issues, it creates education issues. And sometimes those issues with informing voters are much farther behind where we are as election administrators. Like, for instance, no excuse vote by mail started almost 2 decades ago. And here we are now, finally gaining the momentum in voting by mail at a scalable level in the state of Florida. And we are facing a situation where that might be difficult because of proposed legislation. So it is our hope that things move slow, like icebergs, and there is a lot of depth of thought processes when we're considering proposed legislation.
Thank you, Dustin. Patti.
Well, I echo and agree with everything that Dustin has said, but I'd like to add 2 things. One, and this sounds like a simple thing, but it hasn't been. For 2 election cycles in a row, 2018 and 2020, the Division of Elections website has not been functioning properly at critical times. In 2018, you couldn't change your address. We had all sorts of reports of league members trying to do that, and we would go on and test it ourselves, and it wasn't working. So finally, one of our attorneys at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU and I had to get on the phone with the Secretary of State at the time, Ken Denser, and some of his staff and lawyers and get this worked out. So they'd set up a hotline, figure out why the website wasn't working. So we thought, okay, we put that to bed. Well, surprise, surprise, in 2020, on the last day of online voter registration, the last day of voter registration, that website went down. Now, you would think during a pandemic that they would have been prepared for an enormous amount of traffic on that website, but it went down for about 5 hours. So what happened? Well, they said, we're going to fix this as soon as possible. We asked for an extra day of voter registration. They said, no, we're going to give you 5 hours because that's the amount of time that we figured it was down. So what happened? Groups like the League of Women Voters and other groups had to scramble to get out in front of the public, in front of the cameras and say, hey, don't give up, don't give up. You still have an extra 5 hours to vote. So they need to fix that website. And if it needs to be completely dismantled, a new one rebuilt, whatever, it needs to be fixed once and for all. The other thing I would add is that we saw firsthand the damage that misinformation and disinformation does. And so I think that we need to be prepared to be more proactive. And I think that we did. And, Stephanie, I know you worked on election protection, and there was a great effort made by multiple organizations to dispute this disinformation. But I think that we have to start disputing it faster and earlier, and have ongoing education programs to educate the public on the facts of our elections and voting, and get ahead of disinformation, because disinformation is so dangerous.
Thanks to both of you. Patti, I thought I heard you say that there was a challenge with the state's website.
With the Division of Elections, yes.
Yeah, let me say that again. So the state has a website that's not working. Did I hear that correctly?
It was not working the last day of voter registration.
Yeah, the state, to be clear, the state has a website and it doesn't work. Just want to make sure I understood that.
It's
the state.
Since, but that day, the last day,
exactly.
Down.
All right, we've got 2 minutes, and I don't want to take much more of your time. Patti, I know that you want to talk about maybe HB1.
Well, I just wanted to make 2 quick points.
Okay.
And just I want to say now, everybody, request your vote by mail ballot now, especially before July 1st. Okay. We're seeing an attack to silence voters, first by these voters' voices, first by these 2 bills we've been talking about tonight. Also, there's House Bill 1, which is going to be heard tomorrow on the Senate floor, that would silence the voices of protesters. And so we're seeing an attempt by the legislature to silence the voices that way. Then we're seeing other bills, Senate Bill 1890 and House Bill 69. House Bill 69 is on the House floor tonight and on the Senate floor tomorrow. And what these bills would do is attack the citizen initiative process. As you all know, it takes millions of dollars to get a citizens initiative onto the ballot. Citizens initiatives like Amendment 4, like Amendment 1, like the Fair District, they cost millions because you have to hire and pay petition gatherers. These bills would put a $3,000 cap on donations to the committees who get these under the ballot. How are you going to raise that kind of money? Then you have, this is the first pronged attack on the citizen initiative process. The second is Senate Joint Resolution 1238 and House Joint Resolution 61. Both are awaiting their final committee stops. They're not on agendas yet. What would that do? It would put legislative amendment on the 2022 ballot that would raise the threshold for an amendment to pass from 60% to 66 2/3%. So you take those two together and you see that this legislature is attempting to silence the voices of the voters through the anti-protest bill, through these bills that attack our voting rights, and through these bills that attack direct democracy.
Thank you, Patti. Thank you so much for your participation. Dustin, thank you. I am proud to live in Pinellas County and excited that we have the leadership that we do at our Supervisor of Elections office under Supervisor Marcus and with Dustin's work. So just thank you so much. I'd now like to turn the program over to Vicki Dunn to close us out for the evening. Vicki.
Hi, thank you so much. Stephanie, you were an outstanding moderator. Thank you. And Patti, we learned so much tonight, and it's kind of scary how much we don't know. And Dustin, you win a prize for being the best last-minute substitute panelist ever. So thank you all very much. I'd like to remind all of those who are watching that we are going to have a program in May on mental health in Pinellas County. And we hope that you join us. If you have ideas about other topics that you think our community needs to talk about, if you would, you'll be getting an email in response for having attended this tonight. And if you would, in that, respond and let us know if you have ideas about a topic you'd like to have us discuss. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for a really rewarding evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.